Doesn't sound very useful somehow. But I think that Williamson must be at least half right. You couldn't very well say, this is my evidence, but I don't know whether it's true, right? And I think probably in addition, we would have to say the concept of evidence, evidence plays a certain role in dialogue and disputation. So it must be public. I would say at least those two things about what should be called evidence, something that is known and something that is public. But even if we take it in this very extreme form of it is exactly all and only what we know, it doesn't follow that what the evidence is determines uniquely what is the rational opinion to hold. Because the rational opinion includes many judgments of a sort of the form A is more likely than B, for example. So your subjective probabilities in some comparative way. And there's nothing in the thesis that implies that our knowledge would determine what that is for subjects on which we don't have sufficient knowledge. So there's a lot of leeway that is left by this. The principle of rationality leaves a great deal of leeway, and then of course the question is, well, what is going to fill this leeway? What is going to take the room that this leaves, right? And this, as I say, is for me, very interesting part of the paper. This is where Rick begins to talk about the sensus divinitatis, right? Well, maybe I will read one little part of my paper, because this was new to me. I'm a novice with respect to this literature, and I don't know Calvin very well. Even though Al has from time to time instructed me on this, and I looked up what he said. So this refers to this statement by Calvin: there is within the human mind, and indeed by natural instinct, an awareness of divinity. I thought, oh, yeah, no, this reminds me of things that I learned when I was taking the catechism from a sister of the Sacred Heart. And I read Ignatius Loyola, and it reminded me of the discernment of spirits. So in fact, I think these are probably not the only examples of where in religion we find pointers to different sorts of cognition, apparent different forms of cognition. I can't resist quoting Loyola, who is a little bit more poetic than Calvin. In those who go from good to better, the good angel touches such a soul sweetly, lightly, and gently, like a drop of water which enters into a sponge. And the evil touches it sharply and with noise and disquiet, as when the drop of water falls on the stone. So he's talking about how the very same facts will strike different souls differently, depending on the state of the soul and the state of grace, right? Now, when Rick starts talking about this, it's exactly at the point where he is, in effect, asking, what could go there in the leeway that is left by the principle of rationality? After we really take account, to the extent we can, of the evidence we have, and let this determine our opinion to the extent that it can, right? Aren't there other factors that are involved in what is allowed, what is permitted, what is possible as rational opinion? And here he gives examples of the sort that illustrate this thesis of perhaps a special sense, the sensus divinitatis. The example of two climbers who come down the east side of Denali and come upon this view of the Tralaika Glacier. There are very different reactions between the two if the state of the soul is different. Now, I've been trying to think about how exactly Rick means this. And he refers also to references by Plantinga on non-propositional knowledge, which I saw in the book with Tooley, for example. So perhaps I have the same question for him. Part of the time, Rick is referring to this as evidence. And part of the time as seeing things differently. And I wonder how exactly to understand this. Is it that the one climber gets some information of the sort that could go and play the role of E in the probability of the hypothesis given E? Is it that sort of thing? Is it just, it's a special fact? It wouldn't be what I would call evidence if it wasn't public, but does it at least have the same form? Now, that would suggest it would be a proposition. I mean, a probability function is defined on a field of sets that represent propositions or events. So if it's called non-propositional, I assume there is meant to be a difference. But if it is not that sort of thing, then of course it is not the sort of thing that raises or lowers probabilities. If we look for a fact or a proposition, there might be, of course, the proposition that this one climber has that experience. But this, everybody else would just take as a psychological point, a biographical point, which certainly has no evidentiary relation to the existence of God. So it seems to me that he is actually suggesting something much more radical than this, which is that in the discussion of the epistemic situation of the religious, we have to pay attention to ways in which experience affects rational opinion. Well, maybe I should stop using this word rational opinion, maybe too loaded among philosophers, right? That since it affects not so much the information that is given, but rather the way it is seen, that all of nature speaks to us of the glory of God. Well, you see, if you say that to describe the experience, along with it comes a proposition, something that implies the existence of God, obviously. But I think that what it expresses, the other climber were not likely to see as something for him to contradict, but rather to be just nonplussed about. What are you talking about? What do you mean, right? What is this that you're seeing or that you're hearing, right? So now that, if that is the way Rick wants to suggest we should go here, if that is his reaction to this literature that he's criticizing, then it seems to me he's doing more than criticizing logical mistakes in it, which he did. It's almost an indictment of how it is then misfocused. Okay.
I'll be very quick. I appreciate these comments. First, about the assessment principle, I'm really not wanting to argue in favor of what Boz calls the acceptance principle, and I'm not wanting to commit to it. I don't want to be committed to any single sense of evidence. I'm not sure there exists a single sense of evidence. I was just trying to use this as an example. But I'm very interested in Boz's questions at the end about the example. In his written comments, he kept talking about certain, factual opinion and so forth, and I'm a little puzzled, but here's what's important for me. I think that when different people, let's say, look at the Trilika Glacier, the Grand Canyon, or something like this, there really is, here to put it really crudely, the same light would strike their eyes. There's no fact that science would point to that would be different between the two of them. I think whether God exists is a factual matter or not, and so then they would hold beliefs about different factual matters. But the difference between them is not really one of evidence. It really does depend on their hearts. Their heart affects how they approach their experience, what they experience, and then also what they might consider evidence. I think what we might consider evidence, a description of the experience, is not very relevant to what it's rational to believe. However, at the end, Boz says something that really puzzles me. When he talked about these two climbers, he seems to think they don't differ on any factual knowledge, although you talked about how they describe the situation differently a bit. You said one would be nonplussed by it. And I guess what worries me is, I guess I'd have to hear more about that, because I think one climber would say, wow, I'm looking down the glacier, God exists, and the other would say, maybe I would say God is present, or something like that. I think the other wouldn't say, oh, this is just what you sense. You don't just sense God is present. I think we would form the belief that God is present, and so forth. The same as we do with tables and chairs and so forth. Anyway, there's a lot there, but we've taken long. I want to leave time for questions.
All right, so now the floor is open for questions, so please line up behind the microphones. Yes, please, Professor Swinburne.
I believe in both the core assumption and the probabilistic assumption.